There is a question that is distinctively human, meaning that it is a question that only human beings are capable of thinking, and we spend most of our lives asking it. Why am I here? And listen, I don't necessarily mean that question in the way we might ask it in, let's just say, our questionable moments. Like, for instance, a couple of weeks ago, Keith and Kevin, they so graciously invited me to go fly fishing with them. First time I've ever been fly fishing. And don't get me wrong, fantastic time. We had a great time, didn't we, Keith? I mean, it was great. I'll definitely go back again, but I'm not going to lie. There was a moment at the very beginning when I was standing in 50-degree weather in an even colder river where I was asking myself, why am I here, right? But I don't mean that question the way we might ask it in those moments. I mean it the way we might ask it when you're walking into another day of work at the job you never wanted. The way you might ask that question when you're staring at the ceiling on another sleepless night in a life you never envisioned for yourself. The way you ask that question when you wonder if your life really does have any meaning or significance or purpose. Why am I here? Today we're starting a series that I hope and pray is going to help us answer that question. Over the next 11 weeks, yes, 11 weeks, just brace yourself, this is how I like to teach, all right? So over the next 11 weeks, we are going to study the book of Nehemiah together. The book of Nehemiah, we find it in the Old Testament. If you don't know where that is, it's okay. In fact, I'm going to ask everybody, if you would, to meet me in the table of contents. Even if you don't know where it is, it's okay. We're all going to start on page 1 this morning. So turn to the table of contents, and I'll explain why in just a moment. Nehemiah's story happens in the Old Testament. It is, it's a genre in the Bible that we call narrative history. That means that the book of Nehemiah tells us a story, but it's not just telling us a story, it's telling us a part of the story. The story that God has been writing since the beginning, the story that God is still writing, the story that you and I are a part of. That means that we aren't so much reading a story as much as we are actually still living in it. We're standing in this story. In fact, one thing I want us to grasp throughout this series is that your story matters because you are a part of God's story. The same way that Nehemiah's story is a part of God's story. Friend, you are not here by accident or chance or coincidence. You are here because God has chosen to write you into existence. He has written you into His story. That means that your story matters because it's a part of God's story. The same way that Nehemiah's story is a part of God's story. That's why this book matters. Now, what's interesting is that Nehemiah's story, it occurs about midway through our Old Testament. But the events that it tells us actually happen near the end of the Old Testament narrative. That's because our Bibles are arranged by genre. In fact, you may not know this, is just a little side note. The word Bible comes from the root word biblia. And if you've taken Spanish before, you know that the word biblioteca means what, Leticia? What's it mean? Biblioteca. Library. Biblioteca means library. And if you go down to the library, just right down the road, all the books in that library are going to be categorized by genre. The same is true with our Bible. The Bible is just a library of 66 books. And they're organized by genre, by category. And so even though not Nehemiah's story happens at the end of the Old Testament, it appears midway through our Old Testament Bible, or through the Old Testament in our Bible. But if we don't take a few minutes to kind of get a picture of what's happening, the buildup that leads up to Nehemiah, it's going to be like, walking into a movie halfway through. You see the things on the screen, you know that there's some tension here, you know something's going on, you're just not aware of what's going on. I took my son to see the new Mario movie yesterday, and We got there 10 minutes early. We watched from the beginning, and I still had no clue what was going on. Like, he had to explain everything to me as we were going. Some of you feel that way about the Bible. Some of you, you've come to the Bible, you're like, I don't know what this is saying. I have no clue what's going on here. And so if you will, just for a few moments, allow me to kind of explain to you very, very simply. We're not going to get into the weeds, but just explain to you just a very basic kind of timeline that leads us through the Old Testament up to the events of Nehemiah to help us get a picture of what's going on. So right there in your table of contents, the first 5 books of the Bible, Genesis, Exodus, Leviticus, Numbers, Deuteronomy, this makes up what we call the Torah or the law. And these 5 books, they basically put before us how God has created, selected, and ultimately rescued a chosen people for himself, the Israelites. But even beyond that, these 5 books, they tell us the foundational truth of the Bible, that God is holy, that humanity is broken, and yet God is deeply committed to fixing what sin has ruined. Amen? After those 5 books, we get a book called Joshua. This tells us how God has delivered those people into a land, the promised land. And we would think that these people would be so content to just live in this land, to enjoy this land, to worship God in this land, but that ain't what we see, is it? No, in fact, the very next book, the book of Judges, shows us how these people, they just continue to drift away from God. It even tells us that these people, that they did what was right in their own eyes, not what was right in God's eyes. And it leads to compromise, it leads to brokenness, it leads to chaos. And yet, despite Israel's rebellion, we still see glimmers of God's faithfulness, don't we? So for instance, the book of Ruth, right after Judges, Ruth happens during the time of the Judges. And what Ruth shows us is that even in dark times, God is still at work. He's still faithful. He's still working, and he often works through the most unlikely people. It's a beautiful story. Maybe at some point we'll go through the book of Ruth together. And then after Ruth, we get a series of books, 1st and 2nd Samuel, 1st and 2nd Kings, and 1st and 2nd Chronicles. And in a nutshell, these books, they are really centered around the kings of Israel. What happens during their reign? What happens during their rule? And newsflash, it's mostly not good. We know that the pinnacle, like the height of Israel's kingdom, happens under King David's reign. And yet even King David's story is riddled with dark moments, sinful moments. Not long after David and his son Solomon, things really begin to unravel. In the mid-900s BC, the kingdom of Israel actually splits in half. There's a northern kingdom which retains the name Israel. There's a southern kingdom which comes to be known as Judah. And in time, both of these kingdoms, they become deeply ungodly. And because of that, God allows them to experience the very thing he promised would happen all the way back in the Torah if they continued to rebel against him. He allows them to experience the consequence of that sin. He sends them into exile. So these people that God saved out of slavery and brought into the land, God takes them out of that land and sends them back into slavery. He says, you don't want to worship me? Well, I'll send you back to what it was like without me. It begins around 722 BC. The Assyrian Empire, they conquer the northern kingdom. Then in 586 BC, Babylon, you're not writing these dates down. There's going to be a test in just a little bit. You need to write these down. 586 BC, the Babylonian Empire, they come through, they overthrow the Assyrians, they destroy the city of Jerusalem, they tear down the temple, they kill many Israelites, and the rest of them, they take off to Babylon to be their slaves. And the people spend almost 70 years in exile in Babylon. By the way, this is where we get the stories of like Daniel happens during the Babylonian exile. The prophecies of Ezekiel happen during the Babylonian exile. And then something changes. In 539 BC, when the Persians overtake the Babylonians, King Cyrus, the Persian king, he does something radical. He allows these people groups to start going back to their homelands, including the Israelites. And so a portion, not everybody, some of the Israelites have to stay and be slaves in Persia, but a portion of them start to make their way back. They go back to Jerusalem, and the very first thing they want to do is they want to rebuild the temple. They want to build the church. And so they do. A man named Zerubbabel, he leads this effort to build. That's a great name, by the way, Zerubbabel. All right, there you go. He rebuilds the temple. And it's, they rebuild it, but it is a shadow of its former glory. I mean, people are crying because it's just not as great as it was. After Zerubbabel, there's a man named Ezra. He's a priest, a teacher of the law, and he comes back to Jerusalem, and he leads this spiritual revival. And the people begin to worship God the way that they were supposed to be worshiping him all along. And yet, despite all this, things still aren't where they're supposed to be. There's still problems. The main problem being the fact that even though the temple is built and even though the people are worshiping God once again, the walls of the city still stay in ruins, which in those days meant that they were a sitting duck for all their enemies. And that leads us to the story of Nehemiah. Nehemiah's name in the Hebrew is pronounced Nehemiah. And I don't say that to show off. I say it because it's fun to say. Nehemiah, all right? In fact, you can say it with me. Just be careful not to hock a loogie on your neighbor there when you get that guttural, right? Ready? 1, 2, 3. Nehemiah. All right, very good. In the Bible, names are really, really important. And the name Nehemiah is a fitting name. Nehemiah's name literally means God has comforted. And it is through Nehemiah's leadership that God is going to bring comfort to his people. He's going to bring comfort to Jerusalem once again. But at the beginning of Nehemiah's story, nobody knows that yet. Not even Nehemiah. But he's about to find out. And so are we. So look with me. Here we go. We're starting off on our journey. Nehemiah chapter 1, verse 1. These are the words of Nehemiah, son of Hakaliah. In late autumn, in the month of Kislev, in the 20th year of King Artaxerxes' reign, I was at the fortress of Susa. Verse 2. Hanani, by the way, if you know anybody expecting, I'm giving you a gold mine of baby names right here. I think we need to bring these back. Hanani, one of my brothers, came to visit me with some other men who had just arrived from Judah. And I asked them about the Jews who had returned there from captivity and about how things were going in Jerusalem. Now, we're not going to get very far this morning, and I just want to point out a couple of observations to set us off on our journey. The first principle I want to put before you is this: God orchestrates the ordinary. God orchestrates the ordinary. You know, when we think about an orchestra, right, a big symphony that's being played, and we think about those moments, a lot of us, our mind immediately goes to the big moments, right, where all the music crescendos and like the conductor's arms are going crazy. Like, that's what we tend to think about. And that's how we often think about God in the Bible. The most memorable moments are the big moments where God's hand just seems to be going crazy. The splitting of the Red Sea, Daniel in the lion's den. I mean, the resurrection of Jesus, like we talked about last week. But the truth is that God is not just orchestrating the big moments, he's orchestrating every moment. God doesn't just orchestrate the crescendos, he orchestrates the ordinary. That's what I love so much about the story of Nehemiah. This is a regular dude. Nehemiah is not a priest. He's not a prince. He's not even an important, prominent person. Nehemiah is a regular person. He's a son. He's a brother. He's no one of real significance. In fact, Nehemiah was a slave. It says that he's serving in the 20th year of the Persian king Artaxerxes. And what was his specific job, you ask? Well, we find out at the very end of this chapter. Verse 11 says this: in those days, I was the king's cupbearer. Now, a cupbearer isn't exactly what it sounds like. When we think about a cupbearer, it doesn't mean that he was literally holding the cup of King Artaxerxes all the time. That's not what it means. Although that would have been a much better job than Nehemiah's actual job as the cupbearer. You see, when you're a king, you have enemies, especially when you're a brutal dictator like King Artaxerxes. And when you have enemies, you have people trying to kill you. And in those days, the most common method of assassination was poison. And so as Artaxerxes' cupbearer, Nehemiah was in charge of overseeing the king's kitchen, right? He observed the food and the wine that was coming in. He made sure he knew who was preparing the food. And in many cases, he even tasted the food before Artaxerxes ate it as almost this human poison filter. I mean, it's a terrible job. And admittedly, if you're going to be a slave, it at least came with some perks. All right, he's the king's cupbearer. That means that he lives in the palace. In fact, it tells us that he's in the fortress of Susa. We know historically that Susa was Artaxerxes' winter home, okay? Anybody got a winter home? I have a winter home. It's the same as my summer home and my spring home and my fall home. Like, it's my every home. King Artaxerxes, he had a winter home. And so Nehemiah is serving there as the cupbearer. And so, yeah, it might come with some perks. He gets to live in the palace. He's very close to the king. But let's not get it twisted. This is a man who has spent the last 20 years working in the same terrible job for a terrible boss a world away from where he wants to be. Everything about Nehemiah's life says, why am I here? And maybe that's how you feel. I mean, this is an ordinary man just trying to get through his daily to-do list so that he can get to bed in a life he doesn't really feel is all that special. Anybody else feel like that sometimes? But that's just it. God was orchestrating the seemingly ordinary aspects of Nehemiah's life in order to bring about his extraordinary purpose. See, Nehemiah, he isn't born into some random family. No, he has a brother who has been back to Jerusalem, which gives him insight into a situation he would not know about otherwise. You think that's coincidence? Nehemiah's story occurs at the exact moment the Jewish people need a leader. And he's the cupbearer to the king. Meaning that even though it is an unglamorous, undesirable job, it makes him one of the few Jews in the entire world at that moment with any amount of influence. So what a thought. Listen, all the aspects of Nehemiah's life that make him question his purpose and place in life actually reveal his purpose and place in life. And the same may be true for you. Because God, listen, God is the great orchestrator, and he doesn't waste anything. He doesn't waste anything about your life. And so what that means is that even though we may feel like we are just moseying through the mundane moments of our lives, there is a God who is orchestrating even the ordinary parts of an extraordinary service, extraordinary story. When I was in high school, believe it or not, I played football, all right? Okay. And listen, football was and still is one of the things that I love more than anything. I mean, it's my passion. I love football. I love everything about it. But the summer before my junior year, I felt what I can only describe as a very strong conviction that God was telling me I needed to put it aside. And it hurt, man. I mean, for a kid, like, you know how it is, a kid in the South, growing up in high school, playing. I remember going to West Oak football games on a Friday night and just dreaming of being on that field one day. And then God tells me, no, it's too much of an idol in your life, man. You got to let this go. And I didn't understand it at the time. A lot of people I knew, they didn't understand it at the time. But I gave it up. And when you give up football, like, I had to make new friends. All my friends were on the football team. They were at practice, so I had to make new friends that I got to, spend some time with. And so I got really, really close with a guy named Jack. Jack and Jacob, you may remember, they came and played music for us back in January. We're still very, very close friends even to this day. Jack and Jacob got really close with me, and I got really, really close with them. About that same summer, I went to a youth camp, and I felt another strong conviction from the Lord that he was calling me into some type of vocational ministry. I think every Christian is called to ministry. But I felt like God was saying, no, Taylor, you're going to devote your life and your career to this. I want you to do this. And I didn't know what that meant. I didn't have a context for it, but I just felt like God was calling me to that. About 2 weeks after that youth camp, my youth pastor and the senior pastor of the church that I was going to, they both left and went to different churches. And our church went through a really weird transition time, and I was just kind of up in the air as a sophomore, junior in high school. I didn't really know what to do. So my friends Jack and Jacob, they invited me to start going to their church. So I was like, sure, I'll go. First Wednesday night I walked in, the youth pastor was preaching a sermon, and in the middle of that sermon, his name was Brian McGee. Brian said, does anybody in here feel like God is calling you to ministry? I was like, So after that service, he came up to me. He didn't know me. I didn't know him. But he came up to me and he's like, hey man, I just want to spend some time with you. He just started investing in me. He started pouring into my life. And as I got to hang out with him and as I continued to go into that church, I met the senior pastor of that church whose name was Blake Pitts. A lot of you remember Blake came and preached for us back in January too. He's one of my closest friends and mentors even to this day. I got to spend time with those guys and they just poured into me and invested in me. Senior year rolls around and everybody's applying for school and, everybody's going to Clemson. I didn't want to go to Clemson. Who wants to go to Clemson, right? So I didn't know where I wanted to go to school, and I didn't even know where to apply. And so my friends, Jack and Jacob, they're like, well, hey, man, we're going to Anderson. I didn't even know that Anderson had a university. So I was like, well, whatever, man. I'll just apply. If I don't like it, I'll transfer. And so I went and did a tour. The tour was great. I found out that there was a 6-to-1 female to male ratio, and that was enough for me. I just like, deal, all right? So the fall of 2011, me, Jack, and Jacob, we moved into a basement dorm room at Anderson University. There was 12 guys on our hall, and we all shared a bathroom with 2 showers and 1 toilet. It was an interesting year, okay? Because I didn't take chemistry in high school, I had to take chemistry in college. I do not recommend that, all right, for the record. But the only chemistry class that would work in my schedule, it involved a 5 p.m. lab on a Monday night. Awful. So that first week, I go to my Monday 5 p.m. chemistry lab. I'll walk in, and sitting on the front row of that classroom is the most beautiful girl I'd ever seen in my life. Her name was Kelsey Willingham. Her name even sounded special, I didn't even need the other 5. I had found my one right there. About the same time that all that's going on, Blake had decided he was going to venture out and plant his own church, Life Point Church in Seneca, South Carolina. And I guess just because I knew how to click a button on a keyboard, he asked me, hey, can you make me a logo? And I was like, sure, man. So I made a logo, and then that translated is like, hey, can you make us some stuff for T-shirts and things like that? I was like, sure. And it eventually developed into an internship, which eventually developed into a part-time job. In the spring of 2016, I graduated from Anderson University on a Saturday. I married the love of my life the following Saturday. And when we got back from our honeymoon, I started a full-time job at Life Point Church. And within a few years of that, I was serving as the youth pastor. A few years after that, I was a teaching pastor and serving on the leadership team of this church. And then about, 8 or 9 months ago, the pastor of the church that my in-laws go to calls me up. In Easley, South Carolina, I meet Keith Lindsay for the very first time. And I'm sure you can put the rest of the story together. God orchestrates the ordinary details of our life. And if you had told me as a 16-year-old kid feeling like God was telling him to quit football, that it would lead to where I literally am standing right now, I couldn't have written that story. But that's how God works. And when I ask the question, why am I here? That's the story that comes to mind. God orchestrates the ordinary. He's orchestrating the ordinary moments of your life. Even when you don't think he is, he is. And since that is true, that leads to the second principle I want to put before you very quickly. And it is that God has you strategically positioned for a specific purpose. Even right now, where you are, God has you strategically positioned for a specific purpose. So listen, just like Nehemiah, what if the job you hate has been ordained by God to give you strategic influence in somebody's life? What if the house you so desperately wish you could move out of has you strategically positioned to do a specific ministry in your neighborhood? What if the classes that you're just trying to get through so that you can get to the summer break or get to graduation, what if those classes are strategic opportunities that God has put before you to have a lifelong impact? What if the situation that you wish God would take you out of is exactly the situation he wants you to be in for his purpose and for his kingdom? You see, so many Christians have no sense of adventure and no sense of purpose. And I think that's because we're so busy envying the lives of others. So many of us, we just want to make our lives better. And because we just want to make our lives better, we're missing out on how our lives actually matter right now. Most of us just assume that purpose is somewhere out there, but what if purpose is right here? Right where you are. Because if God isn't calling you somewhere else, or if he hasn't moved you to something new, maybe, just maybe, he has you right where he wants you. Did you think about that? Friends, it is not a matter of if we have purpose, it's a matter of seeing your purpose. And so the question is, how do we see it? How do we begin to see our lives as meaningful now, right where they are, right where we are? How do we do that? How do we see the specific purpose that God has strategically positioned us for? Well, how did Nehemiah do it? Let's look very quickly. Look at verse 3. So Nehemiah said, "They said to me, things are not going well for those who have returned to the province of Judah. They're in great trouble and disgrace. The wall of Jerusalem has been torn down, and the gates have been destroyed by fire." When I heard this, I sat down and wept. In fact, for days I mourned, I fasted, and I prayed to the God of heaven. This is as far as we're going to get this morning, and we'll talk more about this as we go, but here's the big thing I want you to see. Right now, this moment, this exact moment in verse 4 is the moment that awakens Nehemiah's purpose. It is the moment that moves him from just being a common cupbearer to a courageous leader. It is the moment that connects the ordinary details of his life to the greater story that God is actually writing. When Nehemiah hears about the broken walls in Jerusalem, his heart breaks and his purpose is born. And so here's what I would ask you, just today. This is just something I want to leave. I'm going to put a little pebble in your shoe as we leave in just a moment. What is broken around you? What is broken around you? Where do you see a need? Where do you see a problem? Where do you see something that needs to be rebuilt, something that needs to be restored, something that needs to be renewed? Because that very well may be the purpose God has strategically positioned you to fix. I have a friend who moved to a city, in the area that he moved to, he very quickly found youth, students, who had no safe or positive place to spend their free time. And so he saw all these students in this community just getting in all kinds of trouble that they shouldn't have been in. They were getting involved in gangs. They were ended up in juvie, even jail. And it broke him. And so you know what he did? He bought a house in that area, he kind of fixed it up, and he turned it into a youth center. And it's nothing extravagant, by the way. I mean, they got a little concrete pad out back where they play basketball. Somebody donated a pool table. There's some video games. I mean, it's nothing special. Once a week, they do a Bible study, just a small little Bible study with these students, and here's what they're seeing. They are seeing these students. Some of them make decisions to follow Jesus, but many of them making decisions that have changed their lives for the better. And nobody asked him to do it. Nobody asked him to do it. Neither did he go to the church and say, hey, I see this need. Can y'all do something about this? No. Mike saw something and it broke his heart and it moved him to action. He found a calling. And so I'll ask you, what is broken around you? And look right at me. Don't rush through that. Because that's what we tend to do, isn't it? We tend to rush through the awkward so that we can just get to it and move on with we feel like we can let ourselves off the hook. So we think, hey, if I just don't make eye contact with that homeless person, or like if I could just get through the sermon without him talking to me, if I just kind of get back to my car, or like, man, if I could just wave and get inside as quickly as possible so that I don't have to have the conversation, or if I see that person at the end of the aisle, man, did they see me? Oh, maybe I can get around to the other aisle before I have to talk to them. We so quickly rush past the brokenness in our lives so that we can let ourselves off the hook. That is not what Nehemiah does. Nehemiah doesn't brush off brokenness. He doesn't tell Hananiah, well, that sucks, man. Hope it works out. He allows that brokenness to sit with him. He acknowledges it, and it breaks him, and it leads to purpose and calling right where he is. And listen, I'm not trying to guilt trip us. I'm just saying, as followers of Jesus, we have been let off the hook for our sin because of the cross of Jesus Christ. Amen? We thank God for that. But we have not been let off the hook to serve. Did you hear me? And let me tell you why. Because 500 years after Nehemiah's story, there was another man. And this man, he would hear about a broken humanity. And he would weep and mourn over the state of these people. And this was a man, he wasn't a slave like Nehemiah. In fact, he was a king. And yet, he made himself like a slave in order to save his people. He wasn't a cupbearer like Nehemiah, at least in the sense that Nehemiah was, the kind of cupbearer who protects the king from poison. No, this was the kind of cupbearer who would drink the full cup of God's wrath to save his people. This man, he didn't lift up walls in order to restore a city. He lifted himself up on a cross to restore us. And that man's name was Jesus. And church, aren't you glad that when you were in your most broken place, when you were in your sin, when you were in your greatest moment of need, Jesus didn't look past you, he didn't look the other way, he didn't try to get past you as quick as he could, he stepped in. Jesus is the answer to that question, by the way. The question, why am I here? And those of us who are followers of Jesus, the point of our stories is to continue his story, to see the world through his eyes, to allow the brokenness that we see to break us and move us to action, the same way that Jesus did and the same way that Nehemiah did. The question is, will we? Will we?